Alright people, welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome to chapter number 5 of Economic Survey. So as you all know that we are continuing with Economic Survey and today's chapter is going to be short and crisp. The reason is that inflation is an important topic, but it's not that important. I mean, there are not many details, but there are a few concepts that are of importance in this chapter. So we would like to discuss all of them so that in case there is a question with respect to that, we are able to tackle all of it. Okay, so I won't bother you with any more of introduction. I would straight away jump into today's lecture. We would save time, and this save time would be spent more on revising from the notes. Okay, so the notes might be a little heavy for this lecture. The lecture won't be that heavy, but the notes would be a little heavy because rather than conceptual things, there is a lot of information that you have to cram. So for that reason and that reason alone, the notes might be a little heavy. Okay, I'm again saying might. I'll try to summarize it as much as possible, but it might be there. Nonetheless, the lecture is going to be short and crisp because it's inflation. There are a few concepts. First of all, everybody already understands inflation. Okay, so we'll quickly finish this chapter. All right, okay, so let's begin. So inflation, just a second. Yeah. So inflation, just a second again. Yeah. Inflation tamed and anchored. So basically, this topic is saying, the Economic Survey chapter number 5 is saying that inflation, which has been a persistent problem for India, has been always a persistent problem for India. India always generally witnesses high inflation. We all know about it. But this time around, inflation reached record lows. Inflation is well under control. That's hence the words tamed and anchored. Now, tamed means that the beast of inflation has been tamed. Anchored means there is one more thing that RBI keeps a track of, and that is inflationary expectations. What do people expect that what inflation would be in 2 months from now or 6 months in future, right? So those are called inflationary expectations, and RBI also keeps a track of those expectations because people's expectations of inflation are also important. So those expectations are also anchored. Inflation itself is anchored. Okay. Now, how anchored the inflation is, plus there are a few concepts here and there which we'll talk about. So let's talk about this. Okay. So yeah, India achieves stability without sacrificing growth. You see, generally, when your inflation level declines, it's known as disinflation. Okay. Now, disinflation generally is accompanied with decline in GDP growth. Okay. Disinflation, and I'm not talking about deflation. Deflation always has recession, but disinflation generally sees decline in GDP growth. And decline can be small or big. So if it was 8% growth rate, it might be 7% if there is disinflation. Okay, but basically disinflation is accompanied with decline in GDP growth rate. That is not the case with India. India is basically seeing decline in inflation, retail inflation, that is CPI based inflation, consumer price index, and high growth rate, which is weird. Okay, so this means that India is in this sweet spot. And there is a name for this sweet spot. We'll talk about this name. But this sweet spot is high growth rate, low inflation. So there was sharp disinflation. And yes, disinflationary trends are global. I mean, all over the world, countries are seeing disinflationary trends. But India has seen a dramatic disinflationary trend. Okay, the world is seeing decline in inflation, but India especially is seeing significant decline in inflation. Okay, now the reason why inflation has fallen so dramatically in India is because a big component of CPI is food inflation, and food prices have dropped dramatically. And the reason for that is, well, you should follow this general rule. I am sure you are already aware of this general rule. Prices are driven by these two forces called demand and supply. Okay, this is demand, this is supply. Whenever demand is higher than supply, prices would rise. But when supply outstrips demand, prices fall. Now, in case of food inflation, well, there have been cases of record production in vegetables, pulses, spices, because of which supply went upwards. Okay, and because of that, food prices sobered down. Okay, though core inflation is still there. Now, what is core inflation? This is one concept that you should be aware of. So, core inflation, which some of you are already aware of, non-food, non-fuel component of inflation. If you remove food and fuel from inflation, you get core inflation. Core inflation is still sticky. Okay, it's still relatively high. Okay, core inflation. But overall inflation has declined because when you add the prices of food, they push the prices down. You understand? Non-food, non-fuel inflation is still there, a little bit. Not much, but a little bit. But food prices have declined so dramatically that the overall average has come down to 1.7%. Make sense? Okay. So this is the case. Now, global inflation moderates as supply shock increase. So remember, I told you that globally we have been witnessing disinflationary trends. Emerging and developing economies see decline in inflation to 5.3. World average is 4.2. Okay. India is seeing 2.8 inflation rates for the entire year. Advanced economies, which already sees very low inflation, is witnessing 2.5 inflation. Okay. There is broad-based decline in inflation. Global headline inflation fell from a peak of 8.7 to 4.2. Global average. Now, what are the drivers of this decline in prices, overall prices? Food and energy prices, basically. Food prices and energy, fuel prices. Food and fuel prices have driven inflation downwards. Okay? Yes, there are a few countries which are still outliers, and that is Japan. Japan generally sees 1% inflation, 1.5% inflation, but over there, they were seeing 3.3% inflation. Okay? And for Japan, 3.3% inflation is high. Okay? So Japan rising to 3.3 on wage growth, because wage growth was there, so there was more demand because people have more money because of wage growth, and because of that, inflation increased. For Japanese standards, 3.3 is very high. For Indian standards, 3.3 is okay. But for Japanese standards, that's pretty high. So Japan is an outlier, exception to the rule. But generally, the rule is that inflation has come down. Okay? Yes. You remember I told you about sweet spot. So RBI governor called this sweet spot Goldilocks zone. Okay? Goldilocks zone means the sweet spot in which India's economy finds itself in. And what is this sweet spot? Inflation reduction, GDP growth rate high. Low inflation, high growth rate. Now, take a look at this line. Disinflation achieved without overheating. Overheating means when the economy grows, people's incomes rise, their demands rise, inflation is high. That leads to overheating. So GDP growth has happened, people's incomes have increased, but overheating did not happen. In fact, disinflation happened. Now, this is a complete violation of Phillips curve. Now, what is Phillips curve? Okay, some of you already know about this, but let me tell you. So this over here is unemployment. Okay, and this over here is inflation. Phillips curve is like this, which means that when inflation is very low, unemployment rises. There is a recession. When inflation is very high, unemployment falls down and GDP growth rate rises. So inflation and GDP growth rate have an inverse. Basically, it says that when inflation is down, when inflation is high, GDP growth rate is also high. Okay, because unemployment would fall. So basically, GDP growth rate and inflation have a direct relation. Higher inflation means better GDP growth rate, lower unemployment. This is Phillips curve hypothesis, but right now we saw the opposite effect. Inflation fell, GDP rose. Okay, so this is a complete violation of Phillips curve, and because of this violation, India's economy finds itself in Goldilocks zone, a term used by the recent RBI governor, okay, which means sweet spot. All right, okay, next. Yes, headline inflation means CPI combined inflation hit record low. This is there. Now, there are two reasons behind decline in inflation. Number one is momentum effect. Momentum effect means prices are actually down. Base effect, I'm sure you are aware of. Okay, base effect is in comparison with previous year's prices, because we calculate inflation in terms of percentages. For percentages, you need something at the base. Okay, what is percentage? X by 250 into 100. Okay, so this is the base. We are calculating inflation in terms of prices of last year, because inflation is calculated in percentages. So in comparison with last year, maybe the prices are appearing very low in comparison, because last year the prices were very high. So much high, so high that today's normal prices are also appearing low in terms of percentages. You understand? This is base effect. So this decline is mostly because of base effect, because last year prices were actually high. Okay, so remember these two terms. If you have any doubts, if you have any confusion regarding momentum and base effect, do let me know. Then yes, food inflation was there because there was record production. Okay, cereals production, there were record production levels. So record production drives food prices into deflation. Supply increase basically. And yes, this is basically government patting itself on the back. Government is saying that we were aware of certain phenomena and we proactively came up with policy interventions so that, well, prices would come down. Okay. Then yes, agile tariff offset global edible oil. So this was with respect to, these are case studies basically, pulses and onions. Case studies as to how government managed the prices of pulses, onions, edible oils, which are volatile, known to be volatile. So basically when the global prices, because India imports a lot of edible oil, when the global prices were very low, India increased import duty. But when global prices increased, India decreased import duty, so that it becomes cheaper to import edible oil, so that there is lower inflation. Basically, the government is saying we manage things well. Okay. Yes. Now, this slide says that we have discussed that yes, overall inflation is down, but core inflation is still sticky. Part of the reason for that is gold prices, because core inflation is non-food, non-fuel. Gold is not fuel, neither food. So because of such high gold prices, overall average of core inflation is high. If you remove gold prices, core inflation comes out to be 2.3. If you include gold prices, core inflation comes out to be 4.62. Okay, gold and other metals. So basically, core inflation is also not that sticky. It's because of metal prices that it appears sticky, high. Then yes. Well, when we talk about inflation or CPI inflation, we keep a track of both goods, inflation in goods, and inflation in services. Services like housing, health, transportation, clothing, footwear. Basically, clothing, footwear is goods. Housing is also somehow goods. Health service, transport service is there. Okay, so housing is not a service. It's basically into capital goods. So it says that yes, housing is still there, but health services are stable. Transport services have not seen a decline, but clothing and footwear has seen a decline, which basically says that services, there is no fall in prices when it comes to services. The prices are pretty stable, but when we talk about goods, the prices have declined, cooled. So the kind of drop in inflation that we are seeing is because of goods, not services. That's the whole point. Okay. Then yes, overall terms of trade shift in favor of agriculture. This is not that important for you. Okay. Yes, this is one fact, that rural inflation dips below urban inflation. Generally, urban inflation is higher than rural inflation, but this time around, generally, yeah, rural inflation is higher than urban inflation. Generally, it was seen, but this time around, it crossed over. So rural inflation declined and urban inflation rose. Okay. Yeah, there is in some states, inflation is still high. Some states, if we talk about at state level, and that is because of higher wages. Because state governments have come out with their pay commission, seventh pay commission, and all that. That has increased wages, more money with people, more demand, higher inflation. So in some states, well, we are witnessing higher inflation in some states, not all India average, some states, and that's because of higher wages. Okay. RBI projects that inflation is going to be 4% in next financial year. So inflation is 4%, which is comfortable for RBI. In fact, RBI is given a target of 4% plus minus 2%. So this is RBI's anchor to be at 4%, which RBI will achieve. It believes it will achieve. But yes, RBI says that there are some risks that we won't achieve this target. What are those risks? Geopolitics and supply disruption. If there is lack of supply, supply will fall of imported things because of wars and all. This is there. And metal prices. Okay. Especially silver and all, silver and copper, because we are producing batteries and green technologies which require a lot of silver. There is huge demand for that. Silver prices and metal prices, basic metal prices might increase. So this will push inflation upwards. But there are a few factors which will push inflation downwards also, so that RBI achieves this target. Good monsoon, increasing food supply, effective farm to fork supply chain. Okay, good supply chain. Basically, all of this is points towards good food inflation or declined food inflation. Okay. And last, well, this is the thing, the beast is tamed, story of resilience. India has been performing well. It's because globally we have aligned. If there was a global disinflationary trend, we followed it. Policy agility, well, government was proactive. Food abundance, so food inflation declined. Core inflation minus gold was also stable. So these are the 4 points. But let me tell you the two things that you have to remember. First of all, remember base effect and momentum effect. And number 2, remember the term Goldilocks. It's important. Okay. And that would be all. With that, we conclude today's session. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. And I'm sure it has added value to your preparation. I'm sure about it. But do not forget to memorize, because today's notes can be a little bulky. So do not forget to memorize from the notes. And I shall take your leave with the promise of seeing you again with another chapter in this lecture series called Economic Survey. Thank you, everyone.